If you think words can't break someone, you've never heard them said in front of a crowd that's already decided to laugh. The glass in my hand felt heavier than it should have, like the entire room had decided to press its weight onto my skin. I stood there in the middle of the restaurant floor, surrounded by soft golden lighting, clinking silverware, and voices that all blurred into one low hum of judgment I was trying so hard not to hear. Jason Miller didn't even try to lower his voice when he said it. He never did. That was the point. You really let yourself go, Emily, he said with a half smile that wasn't kind, wasn't confused, just satisfied in a way that made my chest tighten. A few tables away, someone chuckled, not loud enough to be obvious, but loud enough for me to feel it. I tried to breathe normally, in through my nose, out through my mouth, like I had learned in every moment I needed to stay composed. I told myself I could finish this shift. I told myself I had survived worse than a sentence spoken like a weapon, but my hands betrayed me, just slightly. A small tremor as I set the tray down too carefully, too precisely, like perfection could erase what had just been said. Jason, I said quietly, not looking at him, because I knew if I did, I might not recognize the version of myself that looked back. He leaned back in his chair like he had all the time in the world, like I was a memory he had already decided to mock. I'm just being honest, he added, shrugging. You used to care how you looked. The words didn't land like words. They landed like weight, like something pulling me downward in a room where everyone else still seemed to be floating. I excused myself before I could break the way I knew I was about to. My steps were steady until I reached the hallway near the service entrance, where the music from the dining room faded into something distant and unreal. That was where I finally let myself stop pretending I was fine. My back touched the wall, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the darkened glass door. I didn't recognize the silence in my own eyes. Not sadness exactly. Something sharper. Something quieter. I whispered to myself without meaning to, like the words had been waiting behind my teeth for a long time. Don't look at me like that, I said, even though no one was there. And that was when I noticed him. Not stepping forward. Not announcing himself. Just already there in the edge of the shadowed corridor, as if he had been there long before I arrived. A man in a dark coat, still, observant, not invading the space, but somehow defining it. I didn't know his name yet, but I felt it immediately, like a shift in pressure in the air around me. Something about him made the hallway feel smaller and the world outside feel far away. I swallowed hard, realizing too late that I had been heard. Not just my words. Something worse. The truth I hadn't meant to say out loud. I did not turn around at first, because something about the silence behind me felt heavier than sound. Like even my breathing had become too loud for the space I was standing in. The hallway lights above us were too warm, too soft for the way my heartbeat had suddenly changed pace. I told myself to leave, to go back to work, to pretend none of this had happened. But then his voice came, calm and controlled, not loud enough to demand attention, yet certain enough that it did not need to. You should not apologize for how someone else chose to speak to you. The words stopped me more than any command could have. Slowly, I turned. He was closer now than I expected, but still not invading my space, standing with the kind of stillness that made everything around him feel less stable. Dark coat, clean lines, presence that did not ask for permission. His eyes met mine, and I had the strange feeling that he was not just looking at me, but through the version of me I had been pretending to be all night. I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. I am fine. It was nothing. He did not react immediately. Instead, he looked toward the dining room for a brief moment, as if he already understood more than he should have. People do not step into hallways to tell themselves they are fine, he said. Simply, like it was a fact he had learned a long time ago. My throat tightened, because I realized I had been holding my breath since the moment Jason spoke. I exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of something that suddenly felt very far away. I was just getting some air, I said, though even I could hear the weakness in the excuse. A faint pause followed. Not judgment. Observation. The kind that made me feel exposed without being touched. Then he asked, "Do you often let people speak to you like that?" The question was not harsh. That made it worse. I looked down at my hands, at the way I was still holding myself together as if nothing had happened, as if I had not just been quietly shattered in a room full of people who chose not to see it. "It does not matter," I said, though I did not believe it. A small silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable. Measured. Then he stepped slightly to the side, not closer, but enough to block the corridor behind me from view, like he was unintentionally separating me from everything I had just walked away from. "It matters more than you think," he said. I almost laughed, but it came out as nothing. Because people like him did not say things without meaning them. I finally met his eyes fully, and for the first time that night, I felt something shift that was not humiliation, not fear, but awareness. Like being seen in a way I had not prepared for. "Why do you care?" I asked, immediately regretting it. He did not answer right away. Instead, his gaze held steady, as if the answer was not something to be given quickly. "Because you did not defend yourself in there," he said at last. "And people who do not defend themselves usually believe they are not worth defending." The words landed softly, but they stayed. I did not know what to say to that, so I did what I had always done. I looked away, but even as I turned my gaze toward the dim end of the hallway, I felt something unfamiliar settle in the space between us. Not comfort, not safety, something closer to the beginning of change. For a moment after his words, I forgot where I was supposed to stand. The hallway behind me felt like it had narrowed, as if the building itself had shifted its attention toward this conversation. I tried to steady my breathing, but it no longer felt automatic. It felt like something I had to remember how to do. "You do not know me," I said quietly, though it sounded less like a statement and more like a defense I was not fully convinced by. He did not react to the distance I tried to create. Instead, his attention stayed exactly where it had been, as if distance was irrelevant to whatever he was noticing. "I do not need to know everything about you," he replied. "Not to understand what just happened in there." My fingers tightened slightly at my side, because I knew exactly what he meant, even if I did not want to acknowledge it. The dining room was still visible through the open corridor, the soft glow of warm light, the distant sound of laughter that no longer felt like it belonged to me. Jason's voice had not followed me out here, but its echo had. I hated that. I hated that one sentence could still live in my head while everything else tried to move on. "It was just words," I said, but the hesitation in my voice betrayed me. He tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something I had not admitted out loud. "Words are rarely just words when they are spoken with intention," he said. I looked away again, because looking at him felt too direct, like standing under a light that exposed more than I was ready to show. There was a pause. Not empty. Measured. Controlled. Then he asked, "Do you want to go back in there?" The question surprised me more than it should have. I opened my mouth to answer quickly, to say yes, to say I was fine, to return to the version of myself that did not need help from anyone. But no sound came out immediately, because the truth was heavier than pride. I did not want to go back in there. Not yet. Not into the space where I had just been reduced to silence, while people pretended not to hear it. I swallowed and finally said, "I have work to finish." It was not an answer. It was an escape. He understood that instantly. I could see it in the way. His gaze shifted slightly, not softer, but sharper, like he was mapping something I had not intended to reveal. "You are avoiding the room, not the work," he said. I felt my chest tighten again, because he was right, and I did not like how easily he said it. I turned slightly toward the corridor that led back to the dining area, forcing myself to think about trays, tables, routines, anything that was not this moment. But my feet did not move. Not immediately. Behind me, he spoke again, quieter this time. "You do not have to pretend you did not hear it," he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than the others. Because no one had ever said that before. Not like it mattered. Not like it was something worth acknowledging instead of erasing. I finally looked at him again, fully this time, and I noticed something I had not before. He was not studying me like an object. He was listening like the silence I carried actually meant something. And that realization unsettled me more than Jason ever had. I did not know what to do with that. So I did the only thing I could still control. I stepped back toward the dining room lights, even though I was no longer entirely sure I belonged there the same way I had a few minutes ago. And behind me, I felt his presence remain exactly where it was, as if he was not finished observing the part of the night I had not yet understood myself. The moment I stepped back into the dining room, the sound of clinking glasses and low conversations felt different, like I was walking into a place that had not paused for what just happened outside the hallway. I kept my face steady, my movements controlled, but something inside me no longer matched the rhythm of the room. I placed a clean glass on the nearest table, pretending that nothing had shifted, pretending I was still the same person who had walked in earlier that night. Jason's voice reached me before I even saw him again. "There she is," he said, like I had been gone longer than a few minutes. I did not respond. I focused on the task in front of me, but I could feel eyes on me from different directions now, not just his. The kind of attention that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Jason leaned slightly forward in his chair when I approached. "You took your time," he added, smiling in a way that did not match his words. I set the glass down carefully, my fingers steady even though I could feel the pressure building behind my ribs. "I was working," I said simply. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if I had said something amusing. "Right. Working." The word carried something sharper underneath it, something meant for anyone listening nearby. I kept my eyes down, but I could feel my control thinning in ways I did not want to acknowledge. That was when I noticed it again, the shift in the room. It was subtle at first, like a change in temperature no one announced. Conversations did not stop, but they softened. Movements did not freeze, but they slowed. I looked up slightly and saw him again. The man from the hallway. He was not standing at the edge anymore. He had moved into the dining room without drawing attention, as if the space itself had adjusted to allow him through. He was seated now at a table that had not been occupied before, though I could not tell when it had changed. His presence was quiet, but it was not hidden. It was simply unquestioned. Jason had not noticed him yet. Or maybe he had, and had chosen not to care. I could not tell which was worse. I continued working, but my attention kept slipping back toward that corner of the room. Every few seconds, I found my eyes returning to him without permission. He was not watching Jason. Not directly. He was watching the space between actions, between words, as if the real conversation was happening somewhere beneath what everyone else could hear. When I returned to Jason's table with another refill, he tapped the edge of his glass lightly. "You look distracted," he said. I forced a small nod. "Just busy." He studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then leaned back again with the same careless confidence. "You always were sensitive," he added, almost conversationally, like it was a harmless observation. The words hit differently this time, not because they were new, but because I realized how easily they were. Said in front of others. How comfortable he was making me smaller in a room full of witnesses who pretended not to hear. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I did not let it surface. Instead, I turned slightly, preparing to leave the table, when I saw it again. The man from the hallway had stood up. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just decisively. And when he moved, it was not toward Jason directly. It was toward the space between us. That was when Jason finally noticed him. The change in his expression was small at first, confusion more than concern, like he was trying to place a face he had not expected to matter. The man stopped a few steps away from the table, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough that the atmosphere around Jason's confidence began to lose its shape. And then he spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm that did not invite discussion. "You should be careful about how you speak in places like this," he said. Jason blinked, clearly thrown off, trying to recover the tone he had been using all night. "Excuse me?" he replied, forcing a smile that no longer looked certain. The man did not change his expression. He simply held Jason's gaze long enough for the silence between them to become louder than anything else in the room. I stood frozen, tray still in my hands, realizing that nothing about the night was going to continue the way it had started. Not anymore. For a brief moment, the entire dining room felt suspended, like even the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Jason's forced smile lingered, but it no longer carried the same ease it had minutes before. The man standing near the table did not raise his voice, did not step closer, and yet somehow every detail around him seemed to lose confidence in comparison. I stood a few feet away, still holding the tray, my mind struggling to process how quickly the atmosphere had changed from casual noise to something carefully restrained. Jason finally spoke, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone light, but not entirely steady. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, his attention remained fixed in a way that made the question feel unnecessary. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and without effort. "There is no problem," he said. "Not yet." The last word settled differently than the rest. I felt my breath pause without permission. Jason let out a short laugh, but it sounded thinner now, less certain. Then maybe you should go back to your table, Jason replied, gesturing slightly with his glass as if dismissing him. For a second, nothing happened. Then I saw it again, the smallest shift in posture from the man standing near us, not aggressive, not dramatic, but final in a way that made the space feel narrower. You misunderstand something, he said quietly. This is not your table anymore. Jason frowned, confusion replacing arrogance for the first time that night. What are you talking about? He asked. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I gripped the tray tighter, unsure whether I should stay or step away. The man did not look at me. He kept his focus on Jason, but his next words were not loud, and yet they carried across the table like they had weight. You spoke about her as if she was something to evaluate, he said. That is no longer acceptable. Jason shifted in his seat, clearly trying to maintain his composure. I do not know who you think you are, he said, his voice tightening slightly. The response was immediate, but still controlled. I am the person deciding how this continues, the man replied. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, and uncomfortable in a way that made people at nearby tables subtly stop talking. I noticed it then, how attention in the room was no longer evenly distributed. It was drawn, quietly but undeniably, toward this exchange. Jason seemed to realize it too. His confidence flickered. This is ridiculous, he said, but the words lacked conviction. The man finally turned his head slightly, not breaking calm, but acknowledging something beyond Jason. You will leave, he said simply, and you will not return to speak about her again. Jason let out a short, uneasy breath. Or what? He challenged, though his voice no longer carried the same strength. The pause that followed was brief, but absolute. Or you will learn what it means when people stop listening to you, the man replied. I felt something shift inside me at those words, not fear, not relief, but something unfamiliar that I did not yet have a name for. Jason looked around as if expecting someone to step in, to laugh, to dismiss this moment as nothing. But no one did. Instead, the room felt like it had quietly agreed on something without speaking. Jason stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket with a stiffness that betrayed his discomfort. He looked at me briefly, as if searching for the version of me he had spoken to earlier, but I did not meet his eyes. Not anymore. This is not over, he said under his breath, though it sounded more like something he needed to believe than something that was true. The man did not respond. He simply watched as Jason took a step back, then another, before finally turning away from the table. Only when Jason disappeared into the edge of the room did the tension begin to loosen slightly, though nothing returned to what it had been before. I stood still, realizing that I had not moved during any of it. The tray in my hands suddenly felt heavier than before, not because of weight, but because of awareness. I looked toward the man again, unsure what I was supposed to feel, but certain that nothing about the night was ordinary anymore. The moment the tension finally broke and the man who had been speaking to Jason turned slightly away, it felt like the entire room exhaled at once, though no one actually said a word about what had just happened. I remained still for a few seconds longer than necessary, my hands still gripping the tray, trying to convince myself that I had not just witnessed something that would permanently alter the way this place felt to me. Conversations slowly began to resume, but they did not return to the same rhythm as before, like the memory of what had just occurred was still sitting quietly between the tables. I finally lowered the tray slightly, realizing my arms had grown tense without me noticing, and I forced myself to step forward as if I still belonged to the flow of service and routine. When I glanced toward the corner where the man had been standing, I expected him to have returned to anonymity within the room, but instead I noticed he had not left. He was still there, seated again, composed, as if nothing had happened at all, yet everything around him subtly acknowledged that something had. I found myself moving in that direction without fully deciding to, as if my body had chosen curiosity over caution. When I reached the edge of the aisle between tables, I stopped a few feet away, uncertain whether I should speak or simply leave. He looked up before I could decide, and for the first time that night, I felt like the attention he gave me was direct rather than observational. "Are you all right?" he asked, not as a question that required performance, but as if the answer mattered only for clarity. I hesitated, then nodded slightly, though I was not entirely sure what all right, even meant any more in the context of this evening. Yes, I said quietly, though my voice sounded distant to me. He studied me for a moment, then shifted his gaze briefly toward the direction Jason had left earlier before returning his attention to me. He will not return, he said simply. It was not reassurance. It was a statement of certainty that I did not know how to interpret. I felt my throat tighten slightly at the idea that he had decided that so easily, so calmly, as if people could simply be removed from moments like this without consequence. I did not ask you to do that, I said before I could stop myself, though even as I said it, I realized it was not entirely true. He tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the complexity in my words without needing me to explain further. You did not have to, he replied. I looked away for a moment, unsure what to do with the weight of that answer. There was a pause between us, not uncomfortable, but dense with everything neither of us was saying. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet recovery from disruption, but the space between him and me felt untouched by it. People like him will always test how far they can go, he said after a moment. I frowned slightly, unsure if he was referring to Jason specifically or something broader. And people, like you, he continued, often do not realize when they are allowed to stop accepting it. The words landed differently than anything I had heard that night. Not as judgment, not as instruction, but as observation that felt uncomfortably accurate. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware again of my uniform, my role, the distance between my life and his. I am not used to someone stepping in like that, I admitted quietly, not sure why I was sharing anything at all. He did not respond immediately, as if considering whether that fact required correction or simply acknowledgement. Finally, he said, you should not have to be used to it. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. I looked at him then, really looked at him, trying to understand what kind of person spoke like that without expectation of return. For the first time, I realized the night was no longer about what had happened with Jason. It was about the fact that something had shifted in a way I could not yet define, and I was no longer certain I was simply passing through it. The silence between us did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like something had been quietly built inside it without permission from either of us. I stood there a few feet away from the table, unsure whether I was still part of the same night I had started or if I had already crossed into something else without realizing it. The man's words still lingered in my mind, not as instructions, but as observations I could not easily dismiss. I noticed how he was no longer looking at the direction Jason had left, but instead at me, as if the entire event had already been categorized in his mind, and only I remained unresolved. I finally broke the silence without meaning to. You speak like you already know how everything ends, I said quietly, almost regretting it the moment it left my mouth. He did not react immediately, as if the idea itself was not unfamiliar to him. Most people reveal how things will end long before they realize it themselves, he replied. I felt a small shift inside me at that answer, something between discomfort and curiosity. I glanced back toward the dining room, where the atmosphere had fully returned to its surface-level normality, laughter and conversation continuing as if nothing meaningful had happened. But I knew that was not true anymore, at least not for me. I should get back to work, I said, though I made no movement to leave. He nodded slightly, but did not step aside or create distance. You can, he said, but you will still be thinking about this moment when your shift ends. I frowned slightly at how accurate that felt, though I refused to admit it. I do not even know your name, I said, realizing only then how strange it was that I had been speaking to someone who felt so present without knowing anything about him. There was a brief pause, and then he replied, Adrian. Just that. No explanation, no additional detail. The simplicity of it felt intentional, like he had no interest in expanding beyond what was necessary. I repeated it silently in my mind once, trying to place it somewhere familiar, though it did not belong to anything I had known before. Emily, I said after a moment, almost automatically, though it felt unnecessary to offer it. He nodded once, acknowledging it without ceremony, as if names were not introductions but confirmations. A server passed nearby, carefully avoiding the space between us, and I suddenly became aware of how long I had been standing away from my station. Yet my feet still did not move. Do you always involve yourself in other people's arguments like that? I asked, surprising myself again with the question. Adrian looked at me for a brief moment before answering. No, he said. Only when it matters. The answer should have ended the conversation, but it did not. Instead, it settled into the space between us like something unfinished. I shifted slightly, adjusting my grip on the tray, feeling the weight of returning to normal work pressing against me. It did not matter, I said softly, though I did not fully believe it. He studied me again, and for a moment I thought he might disagree, but instead he said, it mattered enough for him to leave. I had no response to that, because it was true, and because I did not know why that truth felt heavier than the humiliation I had experienced earlier. A faint sound of laughter came from somewhere across the room, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to a different version of the evening. You do not look like someone who is used to being ignored, Adrian said suddenly, breaking the silence again. I almost laughed, but it came out as a quiet breath instead. You would be surprised, I said. He did not look away when I said it. That was what made it uncomfortable. Not the statement, but the fact that he did not dismiss it. Instead, he seemed to consider it seriously, as if it was information worth storing rather than passing over. I finally stepped back slightly, realizing I could not stand there forever without drawing attention. I should go, I said again, this time actually meaning it. Adrian gave a slight nod, but his voice followed me before I fully turned away. Emily, he said. I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because something in the way he said my name made it impossible not to. You will not forget tonight, he continued. I turned back just enough to meet his gaze. I already have not, I admitted quietly. And for the first time since the night began, I felt certain that whatever had started here was no longer something I could simply walk away from without it following me in ways I did not yet understand. The rest of the evening moved differently after that, as if the space itself had adjusted to something I could not fully see but could absolutely feel. I returned to my section of the dining room on autopilot, but nothing about my movements felt fully mine anymore. Every table I approached, every glass I refilled, every polite smile I offered to guests, carried a strange awareness underneath it, like part of me was still standing in that quiet exchange with Adrian Blackwell, instead of serving dessert and clearing plates. Jason did not come back. No one mentioned him directly, but I noticed the absence the way you notice when a sound suddenly stops in a room that was never truly silent. It was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated. The absence of someone who had defined the tension of the night made everything else feel slightly unreal, like the balance had been corrected without explanation. Around 10 minutes later, I saw the host quietly adjust the seating chart near the entrance. Jason's name was removed from the table assignment list without discussion, without announcement, like it had never belonged there at all. That small detail unsettled me more than anything that had been said earlier. It was not dramatic. It was final. I did not ask questions. I told myself it was not my place. But my thoughts kept circling back to Adrian, who had not spoken loudly, had not raised his voice, had not done anything that would normally signal authority, and yet somehow nothing had remained the same after he chose to speak. When my shift finally slowed, I found myself moving automatically toward the back service corridor again, though I had no clear reason to go there. My steps were slower this time, more hesitant, like I was aware of crossing into something I did not yet understand. The hallway lights were dimmer now, the restaurant noise softened behind me, and I expected to find nothing but empty space where he had been earlier. Instead, Adrian was still there, not waiting in an obvious way, not leaning or pacing, just present, as if time in that space moved differently for him than it did for everyone else. When he saw me, his expression did not change, but I noticed his attention settle immediately, like he had expected this outcome without needing to anticipate it. You are still here, I said quietly, realizing how unnecessary the observation sounded as soon as it left my mouth. And you are still working, he replied, as if both facts were equally simple. I nodded slightly, unsure why I had come back, only aware that I had. There was a brief silence, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt measured, like something being decided slowly without pressure. The man from earlier will not return, Adrian said again, not as a warning this time, but as closure. I looked down at my hands briefly, processing the weight of that statement without fully understanding how to respond to it. You made that happen, I said quietly, though I did not know if it was a question or an observation. He did not deny it. He simply said, He made it happen the moment he chose to speak to you that way in a place like this. That answer should have made me uncomfortable, but instead it made me strangely quiet. Because for the first time, I realized the outcome had not been random. It had been deliberate, but not chaotic. Controlled. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware of how unfamiliar it was to stand in a moment where someone else had decided I did not need to carry something alone. I do not know what you expect from me, I admitted after a pause. Adrian looked at me directly then, and his answer was immediate, but not demanding. I do not expect anything from you, he said. That should have been the end of it, but it was not. Because the way he said it made it sound like expectation had never been part of his intention in the first place. I studied him for a moment longer, noticing something I had not allowed myself to notice earlier. There was no urgency in him, no pressure, only certainty. And that certainty made everything around him feel less accidental. Then why are you still here? I asked, softer this time. He paused briefly, not as hesitation, but as consideration. Because you noticed something tonight that you cannot unsee, he said. I did not respond, because he was right, and because I did not yet understand what that meant for me. The hallway felt quieter than before, even though nothing had changed physically. I realized then that I was no longer thinking about Jason at all. I was thinking about the fact that for the first time in a long time, I had been seen without being reduced. And that thought, more than anything else, stayed with me as the night continued to move forward without asking for permission. The night felt different as it began to wind down, not because anything had officially ended, but because something inside me had already crossed a point of no return. The dining room was still active with the final rhythm of service, plates being cleared, chairs shifting, quiet conversations fading into the kind of tired laughter that signals the end of an evening. I moved through it all automatically, but my awareness was no longer anchored to my work in the same way it had been earlier. Every step I took felt like it carried an echo of the hallway, of Adrian's presence, of everything that had shifted without announcement. When I finally returned to the service corridor to check on the final cleanup schedule, I expected, without fully admitting it to myself, that he would already be gone. But he was still there, not in the same exact position as before, but close enough that it was clear he had not left the building. That realization made my steps slow instinctively. He noticed me immediately, as if he had been aware of my presence long before I reached him. Your shift is almost over, he said, not as a question, but as confirmation. I nodded slightly. Yes, I replied. There was a pause between us, longer than before, but not uncomfortable. It felt like a space where something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. I glanced briefly toward the dining room behind me, where the final staff members were finishing their tasks, and I wondered if I should simply walk back there and let the night close itself normally. But something about the way Adrian stood there made it difficult to treat this as just another interaction that would fade with time. You did not leave, I said quietly, realizing only then that I had been expecting him to. He gave a faint nod, as if the observation was accurate but not particularly important. Neither did you, he replied. That made me pause, because it was true in a way I had not fully considered. I had finished my obligations, yet I had not truly moved on from this moment. There was a silence after that, but it carried less weight than before. It felt more like an ending that had not yet been named. I shifted slightly, adjusting my apron, suddenly aware that my shift was truly ending within minutes. I do not usually stay after closing, I said, though I was not sure why I felt the need to explain it. Adrian looked at me for a moment, then responded simply, "Tonight is not usual." I could not argue with that. The entire evening had proven it repeatedly. I hesitated again, unsure whether to say anything else or simply leave it as it was. But before I could decide, he spoke again. "You handled yourself well in there," he said, referring to the dining room, to Jason, to everything that had unfolded. I let out a quiet breath that almost felt like disbelief. I did not feel like I handled anything, I admitted. He did not contradict me. Instead, he said, "Most people only realize they handled something after they have already survived it." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because it reframed everything I had been replaying in my mind. I looked at him more directly then, noticing the calm certainty that never seemed to leave his expression. "What happens now?" I asked, though I was not entirely sure what I meant by it. He paused, and for the first time that night, his answer was not immediate. "Now," he said finally, You go home. I nodded slowly, though I did not move right away. Something about the simplicity of that answer felt more significant than anything else that had been said. I took a small step back, then another, creating distance that felt necessary but unfamiliar. As I turned slightly toward the exit corridor, I stopped briefly, not fully looking back, but aware that he was still there. "Emily," he said once more, and I turned just enough to acknowledge him. "You will remember this night differently tomorrow," he said. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then I nodded once, softly. "I already am," I said. And as I finally walked away toward the closing lights of the restaurant, I understood that nothing about the world outside would feel exactly the same after this, even if everything on the surface continued as if it had never changed at all.